My name is Patrick Burke, and I am making this video as part of the Capstone project for my master's thesis for the SIHOS, or St. Irenaeus House of Orthodox Studies master's program in Orthodox theology. And the topic that I'm going to be looking at, the title is called "Be Ready Always to Give a Defense to Any Man of the Hope that is in You, a patristic interrogation of Kreeft's apologetics on the four last things." That's something, of course, that requires a little bit of breaking down to make it, if you understand what I'm talking about there. The first part of that title is a direct quotation from Scripture from the first letter of St. Peter: "Be always ready to give a defense to any man of the hope that is in you." And the interpretation of that is fairly clear. It's a fairly direct command to Christians that they should be always ready to be able to tell somebody else what is the faith, what is the hope that is in us. So that requires two things of a Christian. One, that they should understand the faith, and then they should be able to articulate the faith, to explain to others what is that faith, what is that faith all about. There's a name, a theological name for that topic, for that subject. It's called apologetics. Apologetics is a funny word in English, I suppose, because it gives the when we say apologize, we're talking about normally saying we're sorry, but of course, in the more classical tradition of the word, an apology or an apologetic is not to say I'm sorry. It's actually to defend, to quite the opposite of saying that you're sorry. You're giving a robust defense of what it is that you believe. Well, there's some great examples of that throughout history. Early on, we have St. Justin Martyr, his apology, which was a defense of the faith. And then we have, in later times, we have now St. Henry Cardinal Newman, who gave an apology for his life, which was a defense as to why he converted from Anglicanism to Catholicism. So it's an important thing for a Christian to be able to do that. And you might say, well, okay, fine, but surely this is something that, given there's almost 2,000 years of Christian history, then what's the problem? There's been plenty of written, and there's plenty of resources to draw upon. And in the West, for those living in the West, that's true. There's plenty of apologetics materials out there. But for orthodoxy, for Holy Orthodoxy, it's perhaps, particularly for those who are Orthodox living in the West, it's slightly different, because we're not living in cultures that are cradle Orthodox people. The vast majority of people all around us are not Orthodox, and it requires some degree of nuance to explain the differences between what it is that the typical Western Christian believes on any particular topic, to what an Orthodox Christian might believe on that same topic. Obviously, it's a very wide-ranging discipline. There's no way in a project of this size one could adequately cover, or even inadequately cover, every single topic, but it is possible to look at a narrow range and to see, well, okay, what is it that in the West is believed about certain things, and then how does that compare with what is believed by Orthodoxy? For this project, I'm going to be looking at one of the more well-known and popular Christian apologists in the West. That's Dr. Peter Kreeft. He's written, he has a book that's well regarded, much used by a great range of theological students and to help people understand the faith. It's called Fundamentals of the Faith, by Dr. Peter Kreeft, and it's Essays in Christian Apologetics. Because of the dearth of material directed in the West directly at Orthodox apologetics, very often Orthodox Christians end up having to use materials like Dr. Kreeft's, and that presents them with a certain problem, because of course it's not written from an Orthodox perspective, just as C.S. Lewis is written from, we'll say, a Protestant perspective. Dr. Kreeft, being Catholic, is writing from the Catholic perspective. And orthodoxy is not simply Catholicism without the Pope. It's a different tradition. It's a tradition that holds that it is held to the traditions of the Church, unchanged from the very beginning. So this is what I'm going to be looking at. I'm going to be looking at one very small part of Dr. Kreeft's book. I'm going to be looking at what he has to say about the four last things: death, judgment, heaven, and hell, to try to determine, first to examine what he has to say, and then to look at what the fathers of the Church have to say. As I said already, Holy Orthodoxy holds that it holds to the traditions of the fathers. It unchanged from the beginning. So I'm going to look at what he has to say on these topics, on death, on judgment, on heaven and hell, and see how what he has to say compares with what the fathers have to say. That's why this is going to be called a patristic interrogation of Kreeft's apologetics on the four last things. This is not intended as to be an attack on Dr. Kreeft in any way. This is intended simply as a comparison, as a study to see, right, this is what Dr. Peter Kreeft, a well-known apologist in the Western tradition of the Church, how does what he has to say compare with what Holy Orthodoxy holds on these same four topics? And I believe it is important. These four things in particular are important in relation to this, because of course elsewhere in Scripture, the Apostle Paul does talk about the very important. These are fundamental to our Christian hope. What essentially eschatology? What happens after we die? So they're very much part of the Christian hope. And as I began this video by saying, about Christians having to be ready to give a defense of the hope that's in them, that's in you. Hopefully, if you're watching this, about when this project is completed and the research is presented, if you're an Orthodox Christian, you'll have a better idea of what that hope is for you in terms of the four last things. And if you're not an Orthodox Christian, then you will have an opportunity to say, well, what is it that Orthodoxy has to say on these four last things? And how do they compare with what it is that you, as a Christian in the Western tradition, believe? Because what Dr. Peter Kreeft has to say represents the Western view, and I'm hoping to present the Orthodox view. There will, of course, probably be points of overlap, many points of overlap, but the devil is in the details, they say, and we'll see what the nuances show us. What are the differences, and indeed perhaps how important are those differences? So I'll end it there, and I look forward at the end of the project's completion to presenting these results. Thank you.